Hey guys, tonight let's do something very relaxing and deeply unfortunate. Go ahead and dim the lights, put your phone face down, loosen your jaw, unclench your shoulders. Tonight we're easing gently into one of the most unnecessary disasters in human history. A slow-motion catastrophe, a bureaucratic nightmare, a family argument that somehow killed 20 million people. This is World War I, also known as the war nobody wanted, which is true, and also extremely misleading, because while nobody wanted the war, everyone involved was absolutely committed to every single bad decision that made the war inevitable, which is a very human thing to do, and very soothing in a bleak historical way. So let's settle in. No shouting, no explosions, just paperwork, egos, royal cousins, and the gentle sound of Europe walking calmly into a buzzsaw. By the early 1900s, Europe was having a moment. On the surface, everything looked fine, elegant, confident, very mustachioed. Empires were still pretending they were immortal. Kings and emperors waved from balconies. Trains ran on time. People believed in progress. Of course they did. They hadn't seen what was coming yet. Europe at this point was like a beautifully decorated dining room, where everyone quietly hated each other, and someone had just placed a loaded gun on the table. Actually, several guns, and a stack of treaties, and a very confusing seating arrangement. Let's begin with the most relaxing concept in modern history, the alliance system. In theory, alliances are meant to prevent war. In practice, they are like group chats where nobody wants to be the first to leave even though everyone is uncomfortable. By 1914, Europe was divided into two major camps. On one side, you had the Triple Entente, Britain, France, Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy. Italy, by the way, had one foot out the door the entire time. Classic Italy. Now, these alliances were built on fear. Fear of being isolated, fear of being attacked, fear of being slightly less powerful than the neighbors, and most importantly, fear of looking weak, because nothing terrified a European monarch more than the possibility that another monarch might think they were being a little soft. Speaking of monarchs, let's talk about the family situation, because one of the most quietly hilarious aspects of World War I is that the men in charge were all related, not metaphorically, literally. King George V of Britain, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, first cousins. They wrote each other letters, they called each other by nicknames, they attended weddings together, and then they sent millions of young men to die fighting each other, as one does. This was not a clash of civilizations. This was a family reunion that got very out of hand. Let's float gently over to Germany for a moment. Germany in 1914 was young, confident, industrial, and deeply insecure. The German Empire had only been unified in 1871, which meant it still had that new empire energy. You know the type. Very eager to prove itself, very sensitive to criticism, very interested in building a navy specifically to annoy Britain. And annoy Britain it did. Germany began constructing battleships at a pace that made the British Admiralty stare silently into the middle distance. Britain, whose entire identity rested on naval dominance, took this very personally, which is fair. If someone tried to outboat Britain, Britain was going to respond by building more boats and then staring aggressively at the horizon. This arms race didn't technically cause the war, but it did ensure that everyone was already stressed, caffeinated, and emotionally unavailable when the crisis arrived. Now let's drift over to Austria-Hungary and take a deep breath. Austria-Hungary was not a country so much as a compromise that refused to die. It was an empire made up of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, and several other groups who did not particularly enjoy being told what to do by Vienna. Imagine trying to govern all of that in multiple languages, with different religions and rising nationalism everywhere. It was like running a group project where everyone hates the syllabus. At the center of this fragile structure sat Emperor Franz Joseph. He had been on the throne since 1848, which is a long time. By 1914, he was tired, emotionally hollowed out, and surrounded by tragedy. His brother had been executed in Mexico. His wife had been assassinated. His son had committed suicide. At this point, Franz Joseph was basically a haunted Victorian coat rack with a crown on top. And yet, he was still expected to hold the empire together, because why not? Now we gently arrive at the spark, the very small, very local event that somehow ignited the global war. Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. A man who was not especially beloved. He was blunt, rigid, fond of hunting, but he did have one redeeming quality. He loved his wife, which was deeply inconvenient for the royal family. Sophie Chotek was not of sufficient noble birth, so their marriage was morganic, meaning she could not become empress, and their children could not inherit the throne, which is romantic and also very sad. Franz Ferdinand insisted on bringing Sophie with him to Sarajevo, one of the few places where she was allowed to appear beside him in public. And because history is cruel, this was the day everything unraveled. Enter Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist, underfed, radicalized, very committed to the cause. The assassination attempt was messy. One bomb missed, another failed. The motor cart got confused, the driver took a wrong turn, and then, purely by accident, the car stopped right in front of Princip. History occasionally trips over its own feet. Princip fired 2 shots. One hit Franz Ferdinand, one hit Sophie. They died shortly after. And in that quiet moment, Europe collectively lost its mind. Austria-Hungary was furious and embarrassed. A minor nationalist group had assassinated the heir to the throne on imperial soil. This could not stand. Something had to be done. So Austria-Hungary turned to Germany, its powerful ally. Germany responded with what historians later called the blank check, which is exactly what it sounds like. Germany promised full support, no matter what Austria-Hungary decided to do. No questions asked, no exit strategy, no calming influence whatsoever. Just vibes and confidence, which in retrospect was not ideal. Austria-Hungary then drafted an ultimatum to Serbia. It was intentionally harsh, designed to be rejected. Most of the demands were unreasonable. One of them would have allowed Austrian officials to operate inside Serbia. Serbia, surprisingly, accepted almost all of it, all except that one point, which was reasonable. Austria-Hungary did not care. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and just like that, the alliance system woke up. Russia mobilized to protect Serbia because Slavic solidarity and regional influence and pride. Germany panicked because Russian mobilization triggered German war plans. Germany declared war on Russia. France mobilized because Russia was its ally. Germany declared war on France. Germany then invaded Belgium because that was the plan. Britain, who had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, sighed deeply and declared war on Germany. And suddenly, the war nobody wanted was everywhere. No one expected it to last long. Most leaders assumed it would be over by Christmas. Which Christmas they did not specify. Young men marched off to war believing it would be an adventure. Bands played, crowds cheered. The optimism was stunning and extremely temporary. And this is where we'll pause for now. Europe is mobilized, trains are moving, generals are confident, and nobody has yet realized how completely wrong they are. In the next part, we'll drift slowly into the trenches, into mud, into stalemate, into the long, exhausting reality of industrial war. But for now, take a breath. Let the maps blur. Let the timeline soften. The war has begun, and it's only going to get longer.
All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little during the last part, that's perfect. That's the ideal emotional state for early 20th century catastrophe. When we left off, Europe had just enthusiastically tripped into war. Flags were waving, trains were packed. Everyone was certain this would be quick, because of course they were. There is something deeply soothing about misplaced confidence, especially when you already know how badly it ends. Let's ease into the opening moves of the war, the part where everyone still thinks they're very clever. Germany's plan was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was very German, efficient, precise, overconfident. The idea was simple. Germany would knock France out of the war quickly by sweeping through Belgium. Then it would turn around and deal with Russia, who was expected to mobilize slowly. Quick victory in the West, decisive action, clean lines on a map. Reality, unfortunately, does not respect clean lines on maps. Belgium, inconveniently, did not cooperate. Belgium was small, neutral, and deeply unimpressed by Germany's timetable. When German troops crossed the border, Belgian forces resisted. Not successfully in the long term, but enough to slow everything down. Just enough. This delay gave Britain time to send the British Expeditionary Force to France, a small but professional army, very serious, very mustached. And suddenly, Germany's neat little schedule began slipping, which is always how these things start. Meanwhile, in France, Plan 17 was unfolding. Plan 17 was optimistic. It involved aggressive offensives, bright red trousers, and a belief that morale could defeat machine guns. This belief did not age well. French troops charged into battle with enthusiasm and were met with modern firepower. The casualty numbers climbed almost immediately and very quietly. No dramatic moment, just lists and telegrams and empty chairs at dinner tables. By late 1914, something strange happened. The war slowed down. After the Battle of the Marne, German forces fell back. Both sides began digging in. At first, these trenches were temporary, a place to rest, to regroup. But then they stayed, and then they connected, and then they stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a scar across Europe. And with that, the Western Front became what it would remain for years, static, miserable, and profoundly stuck. Trench warfare is not exciting, which is important to remember. There are no sweeping charges, no heroic duels, just waiting. Waiting in mud, waiting in cold, waiting with rats. Rats that were very confident, very well fed, and absolutely not afraid of humans anymore. The trenches smelled like damp earth, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. Soldiers slept sitting up, if they slept at all. The days blurred together. Stand to at dawn, stand to at dusk, because the enemy might attack, or might not. Mostly they did not. And then there was shell shock. At the time, no one quite understood it. Men would tremble, freeze, cry uncontrollably. Some couldn't speak. Some couldn't stop screaming. Officers often assumed they were cowards or malingering, which was convenient because the alternative was admitting that modern war was breaking the human mind, and that would have required uncomfortable conversations and possibly change. So instead, the war continued. Let's drift east for a moment, away from the trenches, into the wide, cold spaces of the Eastern Front. The war here was more fluid, less industrialized, and no less tragic. Russia mobilized quickly, too quickly. Soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, sometimes without boots. The assumption was that they would pick up weapons from fallen comrades, which is not a great system. Command was chaotic, supplies were thin, communication was poor. German and Austro-Hungarian forces exploited this brutally. Battles like Tannenberg were disasters for Russia. Entire armies were surrounded, destroyed, casualties mounted, confidence evaporated. At home, food shortages grew worse. Factories struggled. The railways collapsed under the strain. And the Tsar, well, the Tsar was not helping. Nicholas II was gentle, family-oriented, deeply convinced that God had personally chosen him to rule Russia. This belief did not come with administrative competence. In 1915, Nicholas decided to take personal command of the army. This was a terrible idea. It meant that every military failure was now directly associated with him, and there were many failures. Back in Petrograd, the government was left in hands of the Tsarina and her trusted advisor, Grigory Rasputin, a man who looked like a haunted scarecrow and behaved accordingly, which did wonders for public confidence. Spoiler alert, it did not. Back on the Western Front, the war of attrition settled in. Both sides believed that the other would collapse first, so they kept going. Battles like Verdun and the Somme were launched with grand objectives: break the enemy, end the war. Instead, they produced grinding slaughter. Verdun lasted 10 months, hundreds of thousands of casualties, very little movement. The Somme introduced tanks, which broke down frequently and frightened everyone. The first day alone saw nearly 60,000 British casualties, which is a number that doesn't feel real. It's too large, it becomes abstract, which is probably how people coped. Technology raced ahead: machine guns, heavy artillery, poison gas. Gas drifted slowly, quietly. Men fumbled with masks. Some did not make it in time. The injuries were horrific, but we won't dwell on that, because this is bedtime history, not nightmare fuel. Let's just say the Hague Conventions were having a very bad decade. And still, the generals insisted, one more push, one more offensive, because surely this time. It never was. At sea, the war took on a different rhythm. Britain's navy imposed a blockade on Germany, cutting off food and supplies. Germany responded with submarines, U-boats, silent, patient. They sank merchant ships, including neutral ones, including passenger liners. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 caused outrage, especially in the United States, which had so far stayed out of the war. America watched, disapproved, and took notes. By 1916, morale was fraying everywhere. Soldiers were exhausted. Civilians were hungry. In Germany, food shortages grew severe. Turnip winters, long lines. In Britain, losses mounted. Entire villages lost their young men. In France, mutinies broke out after failed offensives, not revolutions, just refusals. Men willing to defend, but no longer willing to charge into certain death, which is understandable. And yet, the war continued, because no one knew how to stop it. Every government feared that peace without victory would collapse, revolution, humiliation. Better to keep going, just a little longer, just one more year. So as we ease toward the next phase, remember this feeling. The war is no longer exciting. It's not even shocking. It's routine. And that might be the most unsettling part of all. In the next part, we'll float into 1917. The year when everything quietly starts falling apart. Revolutions, new players, and the slow realization that the old world may not survive this at all. But for now, let the trenches fade into mist. Let the artillery quiet down. And rest.
All right. Good to have you back. If you're still awake, that's impressive. If you're half asleep, even better. Because 1917 is not a year that benefits from sharp focus. This is the point in the story where everyone is exhausted, underfed, emotionally hollow, and making decisions purely out of habit and spite. Which, historically speaking, is when things get interesting, but never in a fun way. By the beginning of 1917, the war had been going on for over 2 years. That doesn't sound long, but it felt endless. The original generation of soldiers was gone, killed, wounded, or quietly broken. The replacements were younger, less idealistic, and very aware that something had gone terribly wrong. Nobody was talking about glory anymore. They were talking about survival, and leave, and soup.
Let's start with Germany. Germany was holding on, militarily capable, organized, but slowly starving. The British naval blockade was doing its job. Food shortages worsened. Calories were counted. Substitutes were invented. Bread made of things that should not be bread. Coffee that had never met a coffee bean. People endured, because people always do, until they can't. German leadership faced a dilemma. They needed to break the stalemate, and they needed to do it soon. So they looked to the sea, to the submarines, and they made a decision that felt bold, decisive, and, in hindsight, incredibly reckless. In early 1917, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare. No more warnings. No more exceptions. Any ship heading toward Britain was fair game, neutral or not. The calculation was simple. Britain would be starved into submission before the United States could mobilize, because America was far away, slow, and famously reluctant to get involved in European nonsense. This calculation was optimistic. Meanwhile, over in Russia, things were unraveling completely. Russia had been struggling since the beginning, but now the cracks were everywhere. Food shortages in the cities, fuel shortages in winter, factories shutting down, and a government that inspired absolutely no confidence whatsoever. In February 1917, strikes broke out in Petrograd, bread riots, demonstrations. Troops were ordered to suppress them. Some did, some refused, and some joined the protesters, which is never a great sign for a regime. Tsar Nicholas II, still convinced that everything would somehow work out, abdicated the throne, just like that. 300 years of Romanov rule ended quietly, with paperwork, which feels appropriate. A provisional government took over. They promised reforms, rights, elections, and crucially, they promised to keep fighting the war. This was a mistake. The people were done. The army was done. And into this chaos stepped a group who were very much not done. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, a man who looked like a tired librarian and thought like a professional revolutionary. Lenin promised peace, land, bread. Simple slogans, very effective. By October, the Bolsheviks seized power. The provisional government collapsed. Almost no one defended it. Russia exited the war soon after, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, giving up vast territories. Germany celebrated. Troops were freed up. But the relief came too late, because now America was paying attention. Let's drift across the Atlantic. The United States had been neutral since the beginning. Officially,